Hey, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Late Night Happy Hour. Brian Kamenetsky and Andy Kamenetsky coming to you just moments, Andy, after the Lakers lose to the Wizards in overtime. 127-124, the final score. So we'll talk a little bit about that and where the Lakers are, and LeBron, who played 43 minutes tonight, looks very tired. We are going to bring you, we had a great conversation earlier today with Kavitha, Davidson, and Jessica Luther, the authors of Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back, The Dilemma of the Modern Fan. It is a great book, well worth reading. We'll bring you that conversation in just a few seconds, but it's worth taking a minute or two to talk about this one, Andy, because and hold on, let me. If we're going to do that, we should take the picture of the book away. We're promotion, but
it's just an awkward way to talk about something that isn't that book.
No, it's true. So
that's not even so much, over promoting it. It's just
bad. It's
janky.
It's bad planning. So I gotta admit, I had all my Wizards jokes earlier in the game when the Lakers go up by 15, 16 the first half. They finished the first half up by 14, and I got hello, it's the magical powers of the Wizards, is they can even make the Lakers offense look good right now. And I'm glad I didn't ever tweet that, not just because it's not that funny, but also because it turned out that they lost. It's because they lost the game. It's I knew better than to start making assumptions about what was going to happen in the second half of this game. And I'm glad I'm glad I held in the words of Steve Mason, I kept my powder dry.
Yeah, the only thing that would have kept you from getting snatched up by freezing cold takes is they wouldn't have thought it was funny enough to bother.
It's
but that's it.
Yeah, look, I find this one. I talked about it on the podcast, which we put out today, and we'll get back out because that section we spend on fatigue seems no less relevant now than it did last night when we recorded. I'm not that annoyed in the sense that I said last night on the show, they could lose to Washington.
Yep.
They're with no Schroeder and no Davis. They're not that much better than anyone in the league. They've got major skill set issues, and the talent isn't that.
And especially too, it's one thing to try to overcome being shorthanded and being deficit in terms of certain skill sets, like you were saying before, yes. Brian, being deficient. I should say. It's another thing to try to do that when you are exhausted to the point where you look like you're about to disintegrate. Mm-hmm. Like LeBron should just take the fine for every single post game, skip it, and get an extra half hour of sleep. He is so dead ass tired in these games. It is affecting.
We should call that Dat.
He is Dat right now.
LeBron is Dat.
You can see it though. LeBron had great moments in this game. He worked his ass off to get them back into it in the fourth quarter to push to overtime. And there were moments where he played like LeBron. Mm-hmm. At the same time, though, he had some bad passes that we've seen of late that feel like turnovers that reflect the type of judgment you have when you're exhausted. He is settling for so many threes at this point. I actually texted you before the show started. I'm starting to feel like LeBron's incredible start from behind the arc has become kind of this curse in disguise, where it's become now this thing that he feels like he can rely on, even though he's really fallen off a cliff, in the last 10 to 15 games, but it feels like something that he wants to go to because he is so tired. There was one possession, Brian, where he had Robin Lopez matched up on him on his heels, giving him a lot of space to drive, but at the same time, mm-hmm. it's Robin Lopez. He's going to be able to beat, you would think, this guy off the dribble, no matter how much space Lopez is giving himself. 21 seconds on the clock, he just puts up a three. He's, I think, just so exhausted. This has become his go-to thing, and he's not shooting it well enough.
I think it's not just him. If you look at I think one of the telling things in this box score, they played an extra, the 48 minutes, plus the 5. They took 44 threes. For them, they hit at 34%, which is of late not that bad. Still not great, but not that bad. Only took 17 free throws and made 11 of them. And other than Harrell, who got there 7 times, and Montrez played great, I thought, nobody got there more than 3 times. Like LeBron took 10 3-pointers and 3 free throws. And, that's a sign that you're not getting to the rim, and your team is tired. And granted, the Lakers, when Schroeder doesn't play, when Davis doesn't play, those are 2 of the guys who get to the rim and take a lot of free throws. But like that's not a good ratio.
No.
And it's a telling ratio. And I said, I think the worst thing about tonight's game isn't the loss, which is annoying, but ultimately not that significant. It's 43 minutes. It's 43 minutes in a game. Like, I was rooting for Bradley Beal to just keep hitting shots, because otherwise they're going to end up in double overtime.
Yeah.
What's the point of that? I mean,
I tweeted this out at Cam Brothers, and I'm not really kidding when I say this. I realize it's not possible, but if the Lakers could forfeit their next 5 games before the All-Star break in exchange for getting 2 extra weeks of rest, I would take that in a heartbeat without thinking.
Can you imagine if that was possible? Like, you could actually do that. Like, you know what, guys? We'll take the L. We're just resting tonight.
I'd do that in a second.
I think they should try my plan that I put forward, which is try to get themselves in that San Antonio. There's a downside to this, and I understand that, but try to get themselves into that San Antonio thing or like the Grizzlies had earlier before, where like everyone is in contact tracing, and you're not even sure, like, does anybody actually have like tested positive for COVID? I don't know, but like just get like 9 guys in the contact tracing program so they just can't play.
Well,
that would do it. The problem is then you got to make up those games.
I don't want. I was going to say I don't want that. Just forfeit the games, or compromise. And LeBron lies that he was in close contact with somebody that may be COVID positive.
Right.
Just fake the need to go into the protocol.
Right. You remember the other part of my plan was just have Schroeder drop off like an Amazon Fresh delivery at LeBron's house. Like, is that enough? Like, LeBron opens the door and he's like, "Oh my God, Dennis!" And then like Dennis runs away, and then now LeBron's in the protocol.
I feel like
I don't think that would give him COVID.
It wouldn't give him COVID.
Have Dennis hold his breath.
I feel like that's possibly a bridge too far to where the league investigates and says, "What's up with that?" Just lie. Just say you were around somebody. I feel like that's much simpler.
You don't think they would buy Dennis Schroeder as a Amazon Fresh delivery guy?
Not unless you like get docked pay for games that you miss for being in the protocol. No, I don't believe that. Which, by the way,
Andy, have you not been? I mean, you've not seen the commercials. Everyone has a side hustle right now. Everyone.
That is true. Working.
You know what, Grandpa? What Benny used to call that? Pocket money.
Mm-hmm.
Just a little walking around money.
Yeah,
because you don't want to spend the principal.
No, but they need to rest. Like they need to get up to this period where everybody but LeBron will get to take some days off. But they need to get.
Oh my God,
that's really what it is.
They've got to figure out a way to get him out of that All-Star game.
Something. I mean, that's really what it is.
Whatever hotel they're staying at, he should tunnel.
I mean, that's really what the situation is right now. That's really what it comes down to. You can try to analyze this stuff and take a look at things. I guess Frank Vogel could try, but the bottom line is they're exhausted. They don't have the horses, and they're just going to have to try to get through this thing.
Yeah, it is. The thing about it is, it's like, you wonder at what point does something like, because we are, I don't know. I mean, it's February, March, April, May, June, I guess it's like 3 months or something, whatever, before the playoffs start. I wonder where the point is where some of this starts to become a pile up, where the fatigue matters, or if it's something they can just work through. Because I think they are all physically and mentally tired. I think the mental part of it, none of them getting a break. All of them coming back for a weird season, which is much more isolated than last season was. I think there's mental fatigue there too with guys who are younger and should have more legs. That factors into this as well.
They need at least a chance to refresh.
See, like this is what if they aren't just good? So Ahmed Yusuf asks, like they are. We know they're good because we watched them play when they had their whole team. Like that's not the issue. You can't judge us whether or not they're good. Their second and third best players aren't playing. So of course they're not that good. But it's just you wonder at what point it becomes impactful. I think that's the question. All right, so maybe we'll talk a little bit more about this. We got Sopan Deb coming back tomorrow to the show. Covers the NBA for the New York Times. Great on pop culture and all that kind of stuff. We're gonna have a great show tomorrow with Sopan. But we'll talk a little bit about this stuff with him when we have him on tomorrow. And in the meantime, let's get to our interview that we did this afternoon with Kavitha Davidson and Jessica Luther. Again, the book is Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back. And here I screwed that up. Hold on. I'm sorry, Andy. I did not put the volume on. So they wouldn't have been able to hear it. I'm going to have to start over.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
It's a really good book. It's not an easy read. And we said this to Jessica and Kavitha, like it raises a lot of uncomfortable questions and a lot of uncomfortable issues and does it in a way that is, at the end with some optimism, but there is a lot of stark, unpleasant realities presented in there. But I would say it's also a very necessary read.
All right,
and
good.
I recommend
that was a good
that.
vamp, a good
Thank
cover, because now I got it right, and we can actually play the interview where people can hear it. Here we go. Well, thank you guys so much for coming on. I'm interested just to start, like, what was the genesis of this book and of this idea to go through and catalog these things?
It seems like you already stepped into it, Brian, with what felt like an innocuous question based on Kavitha and Jessica's reaction to that.
We're laughing because we, first of all, really appreciate you guys having us on to talk about this. We've just answered this question so many times and very happy to do it again, but it's always...
Jesus, Brian, do better.
No, but it's more that, like, it's actually really hard for us to remember that. So it's funny that we keep telling a story that we keep both struggle to remember.
We don't
feel free to make up a new one. It's fine.
I know. Okay. We should have a better origin story, Kavitha.
I guess we would have come up with one. There would have been
after we finished fighting those aliens. Sat down to talk about book topics.
I mean, the genesis of our friendship and our working relationship is that there's just a very small community, but tight-knit community of women sports writers on Twitter. And Jessica and I found each other through that. And we both covered similar topics, a lot of sexual violence and a lot of, kind of just the issues that come up in sports. For me, working at Bloomberg at the time, it was, a lot of like the financial stuff that I saw going wrong in sports and things like that. And, we actually signed a book deal before we ever met in person. This is one of the things that that Twitter has actually been really good for, as much as cool as it is. Yeah. But, we think it was around the time of the Super Bowl. It probably would have been 2016.
5 years ago, Kavitha.
Yeah, that's wild. What is time? But, and usually around the Super Bowl, you have back when frankly there were just more blogs out, but you had all of these, lists and blogs and things obviously geared toward women and obviously geared toward women that they assume not to be sports fans. And it was always something to the effect of like how to survive a Super Bowl party or the cheat sheet for talking to your boyfriend about the Super Bowl and things like that. And, Jessica went to college because she loved her college football team, and we're both professional sports writers. And you don't have to do this professionally, obviously, to not need one of those guides, but we just started, it was just tiring at some point where it was just so clear that we were not the target audience for any of the writing or the media that was really out there. Mm-hmm. And then of course we did the snarky thing and we were like, we should just turn this on its head. We should honestly, because Jessica can tell this better than I can, but Jessica's husband's also not a sports fan at all. So that turns it on its head in itself. We should just write a snarky rejoinder to this geared toward men who probably don't know as much about sports as we do. And see how
it's like Liz Phair exiling Guyville. Like basically just her response to Exile on Main Street.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
Thankfully, we had a very professional and talented editor and publisher at the University of Texas Press who massaged it into this much more serious and journalistic endeavor. Because initially it was pretty snarky, I'm going to say. But yeah, that's kind of how. I don't know if Jessica's anything to add to that.
Nope, that's it. You got it.
On.
Is there enough cutting room floor material for the snarky version? Because there is a part of me that kind of wants to see it.
I would read the director's cut.
Do you know what's funny is we didn't actually get to writing those chapters except for one, and it ended up running in, of all places, Shondaland. So it was how to date someone who doesn't know anything about sports or doesn't like sports. And we interviewed men, women, gay couples, straight couples, and a variety of people. We interviewed women whose male partners didn't like sports and vice versa. And it just didn't go with the tone of the book, but it was super interesting. And as someone who has always only dated people who have loved sports, and currently I'm dating someone who does not care at all, it's an interesting thing to go back and read.
Well, it's funny because I always think we, as sports people, Andy and I talk about this all the time, we always overestimating the penetration that sports has. Like the amount of people, like I think it would be shocking to Lakers fans, the amount of people who don't know who LeBron James is in Los Angeles, who don't know who LeBron is and don't know he's on the Lakers and may not even know what the Lakers are. So it's like, is that part of, do you think of what feeds into some of the stereotypes and some of the attitudes that get put upon people? Is just the assumptions that people have about what they will and won't know, just based on looking at you. You're a woman, you won't know this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think Kavitha and I have both experienced. I mean, mine, because I'm married to someone and I've been with him for decades now. Golly. And we have so many social situations where men try to talk to him about sports and he just doesn't want to. He's like, no, please go talk to my wife. And then they don't want to. And that's just such a common thing to experience, I think, for women in general. But I mean, we as sports fans, like, people hate bandwagon fans when you're a serious fan, because like, how dare you show up at the last minute when it's fun and care. Like, there's this weird exclusionary thing in general around sports fandom, but there are definitely groups of people who are not seen as sports fans. And Kavitha and I definitely don't look, for a lot of people, we don't look like sports fans.
Well, and sports fans, like Jessica said, sports fans themselves are their own gatekeepers. Like how many new Lakers fans are there that there's a whole swath of people who've been around, maybe since Minnesota, I don't know, but like who don't think that those are real fans, right? The opposite is also true, though. I think that, if you look a certain way, if you're a white, athletic looking white dude, someone probably assumes that you're going to be a sports fan. And that's just not always true. And part of it is because we assume that you have to like sports, or you have to like watching sports to be a true man or whatever. And I know a ton of people who love sports. They love playing sports, who just don't want to watch sports. And that's their own, that's how they enjoy it on themselves. So it's been really interesting to see the variety of people who do and don't fall into these categories.
That's interesting, Kavitha, because my husband is a marathon runner and so looks incredibly athletic, but then doesn't. He could maybe talk tennis with people because he loves me and he learned how to talk about tennis. Oh. But yeah, otherwise he just doesn't want anything to do with it.
Yeah, it's my wife is a really big sports fan, and that was actually the reverse experience for me, because I think she was the first, if nothing else, she was the first girl I ever dated really seriously that I can recall that was a big sports fan, and like more than just say one particular team that she grew up with, or like with her family or whatever. Like she'll watch a lot of sports, and she actually found it attractive, and I frankly kind of used it as an in that I worked in this industry, because she had the opposite experience. For whatever reason, she said she had a difficult time meeting guys who actually liked sports. So, I mean, and it's funny, in certain ways, I think she may be a bigger sports fan than I am. She's certainly a more loose cannon sports fan that I like whenever she's watching the Cowboys or the Dodgers. Like, I don't even want to be in the same state, much less the same
unfortunately
house.
Didn't realize the ramifications of what it means to marry a sports journalist. I think it sounds more glamorous maybe or something in that first meeting than
I think it's still the idea of, no, you have to watch all those games or go to all those games. It's been a while, and I don't think that's entirely set in, but it's funny though how those expectations and stereotypes can get turned on their head a lot, both for men and women.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that, and we explore this in the book, one of the things that happens also is a ton of people who might be sports fans are just automatically turned off to it because they have all of these assumptions about what the space is like or what it would be like for them. And that's not just for people who are women or people of color. Like, I know plenty of men, I'm an obnoxious Ivy Leaguer, so I know plenty of men who don't think that
Say the school, Kavitha.
Like Columbia. I know plenty of men who don't think that sports is an intellectual space or a space that intellectuals can exist in, because it can be really hostile to different types of people. And so they don't think that it's for them. And then when I sit them down or I take them to a game, they inevitably have a great time because I'm fun and sports are fun. But so I think that's one of those things that, we're really trying to just make the industry better and more inclusive because we want everyone to love it as much as we do.
And that kind of leads to one of the things that I think is just interesting about the title of the book, even when you're loving sports when they don't love you back. Who traditionally hasn't been loved back by sports? And then the second part of that is who has, and how willing are they to be loved in a different way? If you're going to include all the, have a more inclusive vision of sports and who is part of that world.
Yeah, I think it's easier to say who has been included. I think sports has been built as an exclusionary space, especially on the professional level, and then sort of filters down. But certainly for white, cisgendered, heterosexual men, right? That those are the people who tend to, that sports is built around, and then everyone else has to fight their way in at some point in order to get any kind of space. And so who's left out is actually pretty large in general. And I should have even said able-bodied, that, there's a ton of disabled athletes and they're out there, but we barely ever even talk about them, think about them. And so I just think that this is sort of the historical roots of sport. This is how it has functioned, especially in this country, in the US, but it's true in other places as well.
Yeah, it is. I mean, as Jessica said, the groups of people who haven't historically been included in sports it's a bigger number than those who have. And like she said, it really does come down to who we think are able to play sports and therefore able to understand them. And
or who are interesting to watch play them, which is like, it's all embedded in there too. Yeah.
Right. And also just the idea that, so many of our cultural institutions were not mixed spaces anyway, whether you're talking about gender or race or, or other kinds of things. I think the second part of your question is really interesting. If you're talking about, what the people who have been loved by sports historically needing to maybe adjust to being loved in a different way by them. I don't know if that's necessarily true. It might be. One of our chapters is about racist mascots, and there are certainly Washington football team fans who will have to love their team and be loved by their team differently now that they can't call them that anymore. But I think for the most part, it's this whole idea that when things have always been catered to you and included you, including other people feels like oppression. This is something that has been talked about in all other spaces before. But it's really not as much of an adjustment as you might think. I think that people are just afraid of change. And I think that sports more so than other industries and other cultural institutions tends to be built on inertia, that the way that something has always worked is the way it's going to continue to work. And why change it? Because it's pretty successful. These leagues keep making money no matter, even when we're afraid for their revenues. These sports are a perpetual motion machine because of that. But given that built-in, small c conservatism, sports can also just get better. Everything gets better when they're more diverse and there are more people involved in them, right? And I think that's the argument that we're trying to make in the book.
And I would just add that, what Kavitha said is correct, that we have this idea that sports are sort of stuck. Like there's rules and you follow them and that's how it is, and the tradition and all those things. But also, actually, sports change all the time, constantly. Like we're always changing the rules. We're inventing new sports. Like these things are entirely made up and actually change all the time. So part of it is, it's interesting that like that's how it feels versus how it actually is in practice. And like that's one thing we just wanted to draw attention to. Like in practice, these things are actually, they don't function that way.
Well, I actually wrote about that very thing. I wrote a column several years ago called "God Doesn't Hate the Designated Hitter," and basically it was.
But probably should. But you should.
I mean, I understand that I'm talking to Dodgers fans right now, so I understand the territory I'm.
You want to talk about
born and bred national leaguers more than anything.
Talk about making somebody question God.
Well,
if that's your opinion.
The
wisdom.
merits of the DH aside, the point of the column and so the column was a very, I would like to think, sneaky allegory for marriage equality, because what I did was I examined the word abomination. Whenever you read people talking about the DH, again, whatever your feelings of the DH are aside, it's always couched in these terms of abomination. Like, this is morally wrong. This is completely, wrong against the traditions of the game. This is wrong against the purity of what baseball is supposed to be and all of that. And you have that word and those same notions used about things like marriage equality. The word abomination, and I talked to a biblical scholar about this, doesn't actually mean confer any kind of moral authority. It literally just means ritualistically improper. Done things before.
It's interesting.
There's no moral judgment on whether we should do that in the future, but this is just not how we've done things before. And anyone who's read any Henry Chadwick or anything knows that baseball is not how we've played baseball before, right? So I was just trying to make the argument that there is no moral argument against the DH. I completely understand where you guys come from on that issue, though.
It's interesting, actually, because in reading the book and looking at the title in particular, loving sports when they don't love you back, and the idea of sports as an entity loving you back, I was wondering about whether or not that's actually even possible, just in the sense that sports, ultimately, the way it's being discussed now is, it's an entity. It's a pretty vast entity, but it's an entity nonetheless. And entities in general don't function like that, but they often love the way it's being defined now based on who or what they're told to love by the public and what it becomes important to love. Like Hollywood, for example, in the last 10 or so years, I think there's been more of an emphasis on content that has more representation and diversity in it. And it's not perfect yet at this point in Hollywood, and there's certainly you could argue in times a performative element to it, but that change gets made. But it's not because Hollywood as an entity decided that it loved more. It happened because the consumers of Hollywood said, you need to love this more. And I'm wondering if this is ultimately, with sports, incumbent on the fans and the people who would consume it to decide this needs to be loved more.
Yeah, I mean, I come from a sports business writing background. I've constantly made the argument that we can sit here and talk about equality as a moral imperative, but nobody who can actually change anything is going to if you don't give them a profit incentive.
Right. Yeah.
Washington didn't change their team name because Dan Snyder suddenly had a come to Jesus moment, right?
No, he remains the same asshole as always.
Well, and Jeff Bezos might soon be that next asshole, but we'll see.
I've got hope.
But it's because Pepsi and Nike and hundreds that athletes are workers and that they're doing a job and that they don't really owe us as much as we think that they do. So much of the book is trying to ask fans to be better as much as these institutions to be better. So, I mean, I agree that, nobody, like, sports aren't just going to love us, but it's also difficult because of when our sports fandoms are formulated and what they're attached to, right? Often they're attached to our hometowns, our identities, our families, and that's why we feel what we might think is love, and in lots of cases is, and when that isn't reciprocated, it does hurt in some way.
Yeah.
And I will say, like, and maybe this will be true until I die, which hopefully is decades from now, but every time I go to a women's sporting event in person, I cry when it starts. Like I get teared up to see women, especially playing basketball, which I played when I was in middle school. And I just still like those are the moments when it's like, oh, sports loves me back. Like there I am. I wrote a thing for the New York Times Magazine 2 Olympics ago about going to the 96 Olympics in Atlanta and seeing Lisa Leslie play basketball. And I was like I'm 6 feet tall. You can't tell, we're all sitting down. I'm 6 feet tall and I was 15 at the time and I didn't fit in my body and I felt weird and awkward all the time. And then suddenly these women were the toast of the town. And I had this feeling of like, maybe people think I'm a basketball player. Like maybe they think that that's me. And so I think we've had like, I still have those moments where I'm like, oh, this is what sports does, right? Like where I feel that love back. But yeah, I mean, anytime you're consuming in capitalism, certainly it'd be lovely to change everyone's hearts on everything, but I'm fine if it takes PR pressure or something like that. I mean, so much of my work is around sexual violence and, I don't think universities are going to change on their own. That's why we're out here writing articles all the time. And that's super effective. And I wish it was because they cared deeply in their hearts about the effect on survivors, but I mainly think they don't like bad press and worry about bottom lines.
When, and you guys in the book, you have questions in the book that center around individual athletes. You talk about, sexual violence and Greg Hardy, Aroldis Chapman, all kinds of the sort of the moral questions that fans have to grapple with, and others that are sort of about systems, about more faceless entities, the NCAA, the Olympics, things like that. What is different, do you think, about the way that sports fans look at those things? The way they might differentiate between the moral question of cheering for the team that has Aroldis Chapman, or even Aroldis Chapman himself, or the World Cup. If that makes sense.
So when it comes to something like an Aroldis Chapman, like someone who's been accused of doing something bad, I always go back to who the arbiters of our culture are, and who gets to decide what is worthy and what is worthwhile. So like I'll always say there's a reason Michael Jackson is canceled and Jackson Pollock isn't. And it's because as a society, we've decided that Jackson Pollock's contributions to us outweigh whatever he might have been accused to. Whereas, Michael Jackson, some people have not decided this, others have. And I think in sports, sports might exist on the lower end of that spectrum where a lot of people will say that, that an athlete's contributions to society are not enough to overlook some of the things that he or she might have been accused of. I think as fans, it makes us like, we don't even want to hear it, right? There are certain people who just purely want to use sports as an escape and the stick to sports things. And we've written a lot about why that's not always possible and usually not possible. But I think that, there's just something, like I said, we talked to a sports psychiatrist actually about, when your sports fandom is formulated. And because it is so ingrained in your identity, it happens at a much earlier age than other fandoms tend to happen. It feels like a personal attack when this thing that you love, is coming under question, and you kind of feel implicated also. I think a lot of people feel guilty about continuing to root for these things. And one of the things that we learned in the book, and one of the things that we've said on this whole book tour, is that, we've got to hold truth to power, but we've all kind of got to be a little bit kinder to ourselves also. Like, it is okay that I'm still a Yankee fan, even though not just Aroldis Chapman, but now Domingo Germán are on the team, right? And that is something that I will grapple with from a personal level, but I can't tell myself that I'm a horrible person, that I have to unilaterally stop being a sports fan because these dilemmas exist.
Well, I mean, Brian knows that this is a subject that I find just endlessly fascinating, which is basically just compartmentalization. And the way we do this in all facets of life, whether you're talking about specific athletes, whether you're talking about like entertainment, for example. When you mentioned Michael Jackson, I don't think he's really been canceled at all. I mean, and like the moment I really realized he wasn't canceled was a couple of years ago. My daughter's school had a fundraiser at a roller rink, and that they rented out, and we were on the floor skating, and the DJ was playing a bunch of Michael Jackson. And this was like at an event dedicated towards small children.
Yeah.
And the irony seemed to be acknowledged by nobody. But, I was just like, this to me is definitive proof. I mean, and you look at his influence in music. Like, if you really start peeling back the layers of the onion, you would have to start canceling Justin Timberlake and Bruno Mars and all these different people who've been influenced by Michael Jackson. And I think often it's about what emotionally resonates with people, and therefore we're willing to do it. I mean, we do this with family. We put up with behavior from family members.
Oh, trust me.
Yes.
And I think
Family's the worst.
That's actually actually a really good analogy, because I think it's actually much harder for people to draw moral lines when it's something close to them. And I talk about this all the time, especially around sexual violence. Like, it's way easier to like point your finger at some big institution or a school you don't care about or anywhere else. But if it's in your own community and you have to make personal choices about which relationships you're going to maintain and how you're going to put up boundaries, then people get a lot more they don't want to make those choices. They don't want to have to be the arbiters. And so that's why I always have a hard time when I publish about a school and it's like all of the rival schools, people are like really moral about that school having an issue. And I'm like, just wait. Like, it's your school too. But it's so much easier when it's outside of you, right? And so I think the family, when it's like you need to talk to your family, people get super defensive, because that's actually the hard work. And I was thinking about your question about institution versus individual in sport and like how fans respond. And I would say that most of the time people don't want to deal with it at all. And so it's more like the way that they choose not to respond to it. Like, institutional stuff is very difficult. It feels very amorphous. Like, who's actually to blame? Who do we hold accountable when FIFA is bad, right? Like, it's the entire system. And then when you have an individual athlete, it's like, what do we really know? How can we know it? I mean, there's always like a different way that we can go about not caring. And so to me, I think there's all that work is being done. It's just done differently depending on sort of what entity
Like,
is actually.
If you want to deflect, you'll deflect it based on whether or not you want to deflect it.
Yeah, I think so.
Your moral ambiguity has always been present in sports. I mean, you can go back a long way. And I think it's interesting that you guys, the last chapter of the book is actually points out, like, sports have always been political. And, that could have been the first chapter. I think it's interesting that you made it the last. What about the environment do you think has changed to make the kinds of questions, the uncomfortable questions that you guys are putting forward in the book, so much more a part of the conversation? And I'm sure so much more of a thing that generates angry emails and letters and social media posts in your direction, because these were not things that were talked about when we were growing up in sports.
Well, they weren't things that were talked about when I was growing up in sports. I mean, like, we didn't know about Chuck Knobloch until I was in my 20s, I think that, I think one, the people who have come before us, frankly, like, we are not the first people to be asking these questions and be talking about these things. And people have done this work for years. I think that having a more diverse media landscape, even though we're still pretty homogeneous, but having even the slight improvement in that area means that other people are emboldened to talk about these things that we want to talk about, right? I think social media is a big part of it. Jessica and I found each other through Twitter, and social media, particularly Twitter, is a place for marginalized communities. Twitter is extremely popular among people of color, and it's a way to find communities of people who might think like you, who don't live near you necessarily, if you don't live in a huge city or have a huge network near you. And then, I think if you just take the last year as an example, right? Jessica and I have been talking about, I've been writing for years about how athletes actually have a lot more power than they've ever either realized themselves or be able to realize, been allowed to realize by the institutions who manage them. But all we've done for the last year is hear from these institutions how much money they stand to lose if athletes don't go back to playing sports, or if we don't, if we don't somehow get them back to the field or the pitch or the court. And that means that for a year, and you've seen this in college, I think, in a much more stark way than even in the pros, because you did have, pro athletes for the last couple of years using their platforms in these ways. But, for the last year, we didn't have sports. And the people who had historically kind of been trying to clamp down on the rights and negotiating power and whatever of athletes themselves also had to tell them, no, like, we're worried about our bottom line if you don't play. And that's when kind of the light bulb goes off. And it's like, oh, you need us because we are the workforce. We are literally the product. And that is something that I don't think has always gotten through. America in general is a very anti-labor nation, even when most of us are workers, most of us are labor. But that's something that I think has started to shift in the last year, and definitely in the last several years, as we've just created spaces to have these conversations.
It's interesting. You just brought up the idea that there are segments of the population that, the grand all of us are unfamiliar with or don't know each other. And I was curious, there's a chapter in the book about LGBTQ athletes and the lack of inclusion that they often deal with, and in particular, the transgender community. How do you think is the best way to go about ingratiating them into sports? Because and I ask because there's a lot about it that I truly don't know. And I think that is the case for a lot of people. Obviously transphobia exists and it's an issue that has to be dealt with. But I think that particular question comes for a lot of people from a genuine place of not knowing, because I think it's very easy to go through your life not meeting somebody who is transgender,
or at least not realizing that you
realizing that you do, not meeting. I live in Los Angeles, very diverse city. I've been part of theater communities, artistic communities that included a lot of gay people in them. To the best of my knowledge, I don't know anybody transgender. And there's a lot of questions I know I've been asked about before, like on sports radio shows and things like that, where, how to deal with this dilemma. And my response is usually, I don't know, because I don't.
Yeah.
I think information that you purvey is very important, and I want to be very careful about not giving out information that can be harmful in either direction.
I would say transgender athletes, genderqueer, non-binary, anyone who is operating outside of our normal idea of the binary is real scary for sports people, because all of sports is built on that binary. And so what does it mean if we're pushing on those edges? And we do have to be careful, because this is like real harm that is done to people who don't fit. These people in particular who are marginalized within our community often face a ton of violence for that in their lives, right? So we have to be very careful on how we talk about it. I would say this is such a good question. I would tell people to go read Katie Barnes at ESPNW, everything they have written. Katie is non-binary. We interviewed them for the book, but I just think their work in general is really good. And one thing that I have learned from Katie over the years, I've interviewed them a couple of times for my podcast. When we talk about trans athletes, there is this real focus on the professional level and like what is happening, it's only part of what's going on here is an intense sexism. So we focus really intensely on trans women, because we think it's that cis men are going to dress up as women and go in and just take over women's sports. And there's a sexism undercurrent there that says that like any man could just dress up as a woman and suddenly they're going to be better because women aren't good at sports. Like that's kind of like and so it's always trans women that we're focused on. We almost always do it at the professional level. We're obsessed with this idea that somehow this is going to mess up the fairness of sport, whatever the fuck that means. But Katie focuses a lot on youth and youth sports. And if we think about it in that way, like what I think it really pushes on sports fans too, to really think about like, how much do you give a shit about these? Like, is it worth harming a child to hold these things in your hands so strongly? And we're now seeing laws being put up in front of state legislators where they want, this is so upsetting. It makes me so upset to even think about it. But the idea that they're going to do genital checks on children to make sure that sports are fair, like that is assault on children for what? And so I really do think like when we think about it on the youth level and like what this means to these incredibly marginalized children as it is, like just let them fucking run, man. Like what where is the real hurt? And there's also the other thing I'll just say is that we always want to focus on the maybe 1, 2, 3 that have won something, instead of like all the other trans athletes who don't win shit ever and don't take away anything from anyone ever. They just want to be out there, right? And so part of it is like pushing back on that narrative, pointing that out, saying that over and over again. I also would point people to Chris Mosier, the other person that we interviewed in that chapter, is a trans man. People don't like to talk about Chris because he's really good at what he does, but he doesn't fit that sort of sexist narrative around trans athletes. And I do think that there's more and more literature out there. We're hearing from trans athletes more and more. There was recently like a ban in rugby for just a straight up ban on trans athletes. And there were all these trans women who came out to, if it was only against trans women in rugby, to talk about not just like why that's hurtful to them, but like what the sport means to them. And it's like, these are the communities that accept them and help them transition and become the person that they've always felt that they are. And I just think the more you hear from those people and what their actual experiences are and why sport is important to them, I think those are the kind of things that start to break this down. But I think you're right to say I don't know, because you can really do harm by speaking about this in the wrong way.
That was kind of the only thing I was going to add. And Jessica's so good on these issues. And I was very proud and lucky to work with Katie when I was at ESPN. But yeah, I mean, I think that too many people would have answered the question without fully knowing,
well, especially in sports media, it always has to be a debate, and typically one person has to take one side, or you have to take.
So you're debating someone's humanity,
right? Well,
and we didn't even mention
do it in an authoritative way.
Yes,
like that.
And also race matters here. Like we tend to think of Black women as more masculine. They're the ones whose genitals we got to look at all the time, right? Like there's also a race issue which goes into like sports media and how like to have two white men debate this issue is just like there's just so much cringy about that. And then on top of that, like the lack of knowledge.
But then I mean, you get what we've been seeing in broader news from as a result of cable news. It's just a bunch of people who aren't experts on this talking about it. And frankly, there are trans writers who should be covering trans athletes, and we're not giving those people jobs also. And that's kind of how we can continue to move forward in this debate.
How much do sports issues like this? Because oftentimes my criticism of a lot of these, the world is ending debates is that so much of it is like, is a solution in search of a problem. Like, it's not like the world is being flooded, as you say, Jessica, with, thousands and thousands of men who are invading women's sports. Like that.
There's literally not a single, no one can find an incident of that.
It's not a thing, but whether it's the issue of trans athletes, whether it's the issue of athletes kneeling for the anthem or Black Lives Matter or whatever, how much do people outside of sports, certainly inside, but even outside of sports, like to use sports as a proxy for these larger arguments and these larger questions that they have? Yeah.
All the time. I mean, I bring this up all the time. Colin Kaepernick knelt for 2 preseason games before anyone even noticed.
Yes.
Nobody noticed. Literally nobody noticed. There were, people in the WNBA doing this. Yes, you can say they didn't have national exposure or as big of a platform, sure. But literally nobody noticed that Colin Kaepernick was kneeling until somebody noticed. And then it became a referendum on a broader problem of Black Lives Matter. And it honestly, then that's when you had people like me going on MSNBC and CNN to talk about this, because then you had people who didn't really care about sports wanting to talk about this broader movement that we had, that absolutely sports has played a part in. Sports has always played a part in furthering civil rights and furthering social justice and all of that. But then you have people using it as a really front-facing way to point to the boogeyman in what could go wrong in this movement, right? It is very, very easy to just point at Colin Kaepernick and not say very much, and have a bunch of people be scared of what he's kneeling for, be scared of what he represents, and what he could start. And it's low-hanging fruit, frankly, for the bad actors that we know exist in all sects of our society, who are looking for the next, the next unwilling mascot, if you will, for what the messaging that they want to further. And sports can be used in that way, very nefariously.
And I would say, like, our sports and politics chapter, like you said, is the last one in the book, and it begins with Kaepernick and ends with Kaepernick because he's sort of the face of what this looks like in the modern day. But the point of that chapter too was to point out that sports and politics, little p politics, big P politics, whatever, have always been a little bit of
both.
Have always all been, the letters. It's fine. Yeah, they've just always been joined. Like, one of the things I think about a lot is that we call them political races. Like, we use the word race because we've taken it from sports. You know, politicians love to throw out the first pitch. Like, you know, the military spent all this money, gave it to the NFL to like do their propaganda. There's a way that these things are always mixed together. We don't want to talk about it unless we're like scared. Again, sports is, as Kavitha said, little c conservative, sometimes big C conservative, but in general conservative in nature. And so anything that's pushing in any direction away from the tradition scares people, and certainly that's as true with politics as anything else. And so, yeah, as it becomes a proxy for like a much bigger discussion.
I mean, it's also a function of just who is watching what sports, who is watching sports in general, the reach that sports obviously have, right? 100 million people ish watch the Super Bowl, right? That's just, you know, that's you're gonna have your political ad spend during the Super Bowl or during a college football game. College football was brought up in the presidential debate because it was something that, you know, more people watch sports than vote. So it's a sad commentary, I know, on the state of things.
I did work trying to register voters for what it's worth. I mean, stop blaming me. I did my part.
Listen, it's not about
you took that personally. It's really interesting.
I mean, that's been a lot. Look, you have no idea how much, Jessica, I hate talking to strangers. Like, Brian knows this. Like, this was a big ask of me to like just call random people.
I sound like, but you know Kavitha. You've met Kavitha. Oh, it's okay if we have Jessica also.
Yeah, like
she's a stranger, but she's just a friend you haven't met.
Yeah, like it really, I do take it personally because for me, just that type of action, it just speaks to how much I really wanted people to vote. Because I don't ever want to see those people in real life.
Yeah, our least favorite thing to do when we were like deep in the sort of ESPN stuff, they'd send us out to do man on the street interviews. We're like, I'd always come back and be like, nobody would talk to me, like, because I didn't ask, because I just had no interest.
Because they thought I was a weirdo in the corner hiding.
Right.
Nobody talked to me.
I love to listen to like investigative journalism podcasts where they go and knock on people's doors and see if they answer. Because there's something like I get so nervous for them and like that whole thing, of, like living vicariously. Because I find that that idea is terrifying.
Not for me.
I just watch Night Stalkers, so maybe like.
I don't knock on people's doors. I don't know. That's just not a thing that I do.
Yeah, a good idea. That for me was like the one. I mean, and literally one upside of the pandemic is I had an excuse to do this, not knocking on doors.
Right,
like where I at least had the barrier of the phone.
Right.
As opposed, I don't know if I could do the knock. This election was really important to me. I still don't know if I could have knocked on the doors. I don't know if it was knocking on doors important. But you guys,
it was effective. So thank you.
It worked. Thank you, Andy. Thank you for your service.
All three of you are welcome. It's interesting, really quick, Brian, but you had just mentioned the investigative reporting angle that you find fascinating, Jessica. And I think it's towards the end of the book, Kavitha, there's a line in there where you say, like Jessica, a lot of my sports coverage over the years has centered on domestic violence and sexual assault, as well as the eternal questions of how much, if anything, we learn from each incident. And that in and of itself would make it feel like sports doesn't love you back. You sound like you're both reporters like on a courthouse or police crime beat, as opposed to being sports reporters. With that in mind, what keeps you both going in this space? Because it would be incredibly easy to get disheartened.
I'll go first, I guess. I love sports so much. I mean, last week was a really bad week in Texas, to say the least. It was incredibly hard. One of the best things that happened last week was that Naomi Osaka played Serena Williams in Australia, and I got to watch it on television. And that brought me so much joy. So part of it is just like how much I get from sports and this desire to have it be more inclusive. I mean, I have a different answer when it comes to like the investigative journalism around sexual violence and institutional response to it, which is certainly that survivors tell me it's important to them. And I've done stuff that has changed institutions, and you try to hold those things close to your heart, because sometimes you do it and you don't do a damn thing. And those are certainly tough times.
Yeah, I mean, to that part of my answer, you know, for every 10 dude who doesn't want to talk about domestic violence, there's always one who will send you a note and is like, you changed my view on this, or I learned something from you, or I'm going to be able to talk to my wife or daughter differently about this, and I kind of understand their perspective more. And then you have other survivors who come forward, and either they come forward as a compound effect, which is something that we're seeing in baseball right now with sexual harassment, or they just come forward to you personally and they say, it was important for me to read this. And that makes all the difference, frankly. And then the other side of that is, man, I just love sports. Listen, like, so much of what we cover is really hard, and I'm not going to lie and say that it doesn't take an emotional toll. It absolutely does. I mean, 2016 and 2017 with the election, with, you know, some of the more kind of high profile incidents that we had to cover in sports, was really emotionally hard for me and mentally difficult for me to continue going in this space. But I think, you know, part of it is, again, like, I do love these sports. I always, there's also something about like my fandom that continues to give me hope, and it's totally irrational. And I think a lot of people can relate to this, that when your team doesn't win, you know, you probably grieve for a couple of months and you're going to be salty about it when the season restarts. But then there is this kind of rebirth. And, you know, I don't know, unless you're a Knicks fan, really, like, you can, you know, you can kind of say, which I am, but you can kind of say, like, this is a new season. And we've actually had some things to look forward to with the Knicks this season, which is crazy, but they're going to break my heart again. You know, and I think
you're just one game below 500 right now, Kavitha. You can get there.
Yes, but you know, we're going to trade Julius Randle for like 17 guys who are older than him somehow, right? Like, that's going to happen.
Tibbs, baby.
I mean, yeah, the Derrick Rose sighting, don't even get me started. But I think I think another part of that is also like defiance, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm going to let all of these shitty people kick me out of this thing that I've loved for my entire life, just because I'm trying to make it a little bit better. And the loudest voices in the room have been super loud for the last few years, you know, but we're still here. And, you know, I think that there's still a long ways to go, but you know, we're going to continue to put the work in.
Is that kind of a form of the same kind of compartmentalization, where like recognition that Trevor Bauer isn't sports, like, you know, Chapman doesn't have to, that FIFA isn't sports, like, these are bad things that are sports related, but that's not necessarily what makes sports.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot of compartmentalization that goes on. And I think that, well, first of all, just, I mean, everyone here can relate to this. The nature of being a sports journalist is having to have compartmentalized your fandom at some point, right? Because like, journalism and fandom don't go together, but none of us do this without having been fans, without having grown up as fans, right? So, you know, when I cover the Yankees, I really compartmentalize. When Derek Jeter announced his retirement, the column I wrote was called "Now Can the Yankees Get a Shortstop with Range?" And my was not happy with me, but it was completely accurate, right?
What does God think of that?
God gave me a pass.
Okay.
I wrote my love letter to what Derek Jeter's career meant to me the night that I got back from his last ever game. And I made it very clear that I had my fan hat on and not my journalism hat. But that's such compartmentalization, right? Mm-hmm. Like, in the nature of what we do for a living and where it comes from. So along those lines, you take it a step further and you're like, okay, well, not only do I have to compartmentalize in being a sports fan, I have to compartmentalize being a woman sometimes. I have to compartmentalize being a sexual assault survivor. I have to compartmentalize, you know, all of these other things that we may and may not have experienced in our lives, that in order to do our jobs properly. So sometimes it makes it a little bit easier. And you know, I think sometimes you go home and everything kind of settles on you, and that's when mistaken.
And I will say, like, even doing this work and feeling a certain way and having my morals or whatever, there are still times where I'm like, I don't want to know this. Like, please, like, I just wish I didn't know any of this, that I could just watch this without thinking about it. Like, there are times where I watch things and I just don't tell anybody because I don't want I just don't want to have to like share that with my choice with anybody else, like we do that too. So it's not as if, I mean, I get it. Like the thing is, like, I get why sports fans react this way. We do it too. But overall, I don't know. I just want more people to feel like sports loves them back. It's such a good feeling when it happens.
Well, that story you tell about, what the feeling you get about watching women's sports, like, and what that does to you, like that is the reason it needs to be more inclusive. And
I covered the Women's World Cup in France, and I was at the opener, and they all come out onto the pitch, and I was like, in the press box, freezing cold, which is my memory of it. But I was trying to be like, a good, unemotional journalist. Right. And I was like, don't cry, Jessica, don't cry. Like, I really was just like so overwhelmed by the moment. Yeah, every time it gets me.
There's one thing we want to get to from Kavitha's Twitter feed before we leave, but real quick, and this does not need to be a long answer. Are we in Los Angeles destined to get screwed like every other Olympic city in 2028?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
I mean, like, just one thing that we bring up from our chapter a lot is the militarization of local police when the Olympics happen, and LAPD is already real scary. So.
And I'm real nervous about ICE. ICE is going to get, federal agencies get a lot more jurisdiction within local spaces. So, yeah.
So and I think the important takeaway there is it's more than infrastructure that doesn't get used. And so much of the, the pitch around LA was like, you don't have to build a velodrome. We have a velodrome. You don't have to build a stadium. We have stadiums, but there are these ancillary. It's a really fascinating chapter in the book that people should take a look at. All right. So before we let you go, Ted Lasso. You want to talk about a reason to love sports?
Oh, the best.
It's like a real palate cleanser, Ted Lasso, from like everything that happened in 2020. Kavitha, you just binged it in like a day, correct?
The reason I binged it is I finished Schitt's Creek and I finished Kim's Convenience, and then I watched the Hotel Cecil documentary, and I watched Night Stalker, and lots of just the state of the world, right? So I was like, I need to binge something that is going to be heartwarming, that I know people have recommended, and I'm just like, I'm not an Apple user, so I'm like an Android, Chrome, all of that, whatever. But so I was lent somebody's Apple TV login, and I binged Ted Lasso in the course of
allegedly
in the course of one sitting, and it was delightful, and I'm so happy about the show. And I know people. My sister is not a sports fan. She humors me, frankly, but she was the first person to be like, Kavitha, you got to watch Ted Lasso. The show is great. So yeah,
it's perfect. It's a perfect show. It makes you just feel so good.
Yeah.
I love it.
Can I also like, am I so I think Roy Kent might be my ideal man, even though he's not Irish, and that's a whole other conversation. But Roy Kent, British Adam.
We just had this whole talk, Kavitha, about inclusiveness, and then you make this man be Irish, this ideal man.
I know. I'm sorry. I tend to date Irishmen. It's a whole other thing. But but Roy Kent kind of looks like a British
loving Irishman when they don't love you back.
Oh, poor Kavitha. Tell me who Roy Kent looks like. Who?
Adam Levine, but like not hipster and annoying.
What is that?
I guess it's Roy Kent.
I know. I unsee it.
Last night I watched Far from the Madding Crowd, which is like a romance from 5 years ago or whatever, 6 years ago. And Juno Temple is a side, like Keeley is just a minor character. And I did not recognize her at all. But I'm one of those people that always checks IMDb to see like everyone that I'm watching in a movie. And I was like, no, like I could not believe it. But she is so everyone is perfect on that show.
Can I say about Ted Lasso on like an actually kind of serious, kind of related to the kind of work that Jessica and I do note? I had this whole outpouring of men on Twitter who were endeared to the show and who didn't expect to be emotional about the show. And there's so much positive in it about male relationships that we don't always cover and we don't allow space for, which I think is also really nice to see.
Yeah, that's a good
true.
point.
But I actually think that's something that I think is so valuable in today's sports and today's athlete is young males, particularly young Black males, being willing to show vulnerability in terms of whether it's mental health, whether it's, just sort of emotional. It's kind of rejecting a lot of the always needing to be like, cold, hard, whatever it might be, killer mentality. And you can still go out and just crush people when you play. I think that is monumentally transformational in terms of how athletes present themselves and the lessons that people take away from their athletes. And it's one of I think, the most positive things that we've seen in years.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that was another thing COVID brought to the fore. We got to see the bubbles and they were great for COVID, but we also got to hear a lot about like the mental strain and how difficult all of that was. And athletes were willing to talk about it in a way that, we probably wouldn't have heard a decade ago.
I tell this a lot, just Andy and I are not above, the taking the easy joke, funny trumps mean, all that kind of stuff. And so when Paul George has all of his struggles in the playoffs and pandemic P and all that stuff, and you make the jokes and you make the evaluations, and he comes out. I felt like such an asshole. Like, oh yeah, by the way, I'm like really depressed in here, and it sucks, and this is horrible. And I think and I was like, I'm sorry. Like, you have to, you forget these are human beings. They're well compensated. They get to do cool stuff. They are still people. And so I appreciated Paul George reminding me of that.
Well, and they're not superhuman. And this is one of the reasons I'm always saying, one of the reasons that we love sports so much is it's the closest that we get to mythology in modern day. See these completely human people, human beings accomplishing these superhuman physical and mental feats. And it makes us forget their humanity, but their humanity is what makes what they do superhuman. So I'm really grateful for that next generation of athlete that's coming up.
Yeah, for sure. And just the level of tolerance that you see from like it's like all things, just young people hopefully will lead us forward better than we are. So we'll see. The book is really well worth picking up. It deals with a lot of important issues. It is uncomfortable at times to read, no question, but it really ends, I think, on a lot of an optimistic note in the same ways that you guys have been able to point out over the course of this conversation. It's Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back. Kavitha Davidson and Jessica Luther, the authors. They're also the hosts, Kavitha, of the Lead podcast on The Athletic, which is every day, and Burn It All Down from Jessica. You can catch all those wherever you get your podcasts, as they say. Thank you guys so much for coming on. We really appreciate it.
This is fun. Thanks for having us.
Great.
All right. So that was cool. You're muted. Oh, yeah. Wait, hold on. So this is the book. If you missed it, we put it up earlier. That's the book, Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back, Dilemmas of the Modern Fan. It really gets into a lot of different stuff. It's not just about, some of the problematic athletes, but also, things that the NCAA does, what it means to have the Olympics or build a stadium and all these other places where we as fans kind of have to make choices about what we support and what we don't, and why, as Kavitha said, it's sort of okay to give yourself a little space to still be a fan. Even Andy, while you sort of try to do better and, sort of at least try to acknowledge some of these issues.
I mean, look, the truth is we are all hypocrites with this stuff on some level.
Whether it's sports or something else.
Sports, entertainment, like I said before, the way you often will make allowances for family members and would shun somebody different doing the exact same thing as that family member. I talked before about that, that moment at the roller skating rink with my daughter for that fundraiser, and, noting the, extreme irony of this DJ playing tons of Michael Jackson at an event with kids. But as somebody who's a really big music fanatic and, likes to learn as much as I can and takes it pretty seriously, I am a massive James Brown fan, and I've been a big James Brown fan for a long, long time. That requires you to compartmentalize a lot of really bad behavior.
Yes.
And you come to understand the roots of a lot of it because James Brown grew up in an absolutely hellish atmosphere. I mean, like he grew up just brutal circumstances, which obviously shaped his entire worldview on everything. It shaped who he became as an artist, a collaborator, a boss of a band, everything. And he could be cruel to the people around him. He could be abusive to the people around him. And he could do this sometimes in ways that were criminal. He is also one of the most indelibly influential artists in music history. Yeah. Like he is one in terms of modern, pop, rock, R&B sort of all melded together. You would be hard pressed to find anybody you could argue is more influential than James Brown. Maybe a few people at his level, but without James Brown, rap arguably doesn't exist.
Yeah, and the whole range of things. It's like certain people are easy. It's easy for me to do. Greg Hardy, but you start to move down the ladder of and it is complicated. It is something that we do. Throughout, like you say,
it's largely dictated by the emotional connections that you have to these specific people, these specific entities. I think it often has to do with when you first made that connection, where you were in your life. When you're a teenager and you don't have a lot of responsibilities other than being in school and discovering who you are, like these things make massive impressions on you. And, I don't lionize James Brown as a person, but I can't help but lionize him as an artist.
And you listen to music, and so it's like it's one of those things that is.
But it is complicated,
and that's sort of the book isn't so much about how to solve those problems for you. They don't answer the question for you. These are personal decisions, everybody, but it really does lay out very well some of the dilemmas that fans face when and I think too the betterment of sports in the long run that we're actually starting to look at these questions now much more than we ever did. Certainly when I was growing up, then even when we started in this world, we ask these questions and we hold leagues more responsible. We hold teams more responsible to at least try to do better. And I think ultimately it will be a better thing for sports. So again, thank you to Kavitha and to Jessica for joining us tonight. Tomorrow, Sopan Deb from the New York Times covers basketball.
He's great.
He's an author, really fun guy. We've had him on before. So we're excited to get him back. Wednesday, Sabrina Merchant. Thursday, Jorge Castillo. We'll get a little baseball. We have the baseball, Andy. Spring training started.
I know.
Jesus. Spring training, man. And then Friday, Dave Schilling. And then we've got some really fun guests that we're trying to line up. Interesting stuff, particularly over the All-Star break when sports will take a little bit of a break, a little pause that LeBron James needs. So again, thanks for everyone.
And won't get.
And we'll see everybody tomorrow.
Doc, you need a lot.